Beyond Economics and Back podcast is created by Lithuanian Free Market Institute.
Welcome to the Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast. My name is Ogminas Petronis, and my guest today is Routledge, who is Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Routledge Institute and co-editor of Profectus, a magazine on human progress and flourishing. He's a leading expert in existential psychology. He has published more than 100 academic papers. That is a very impressive number. And he's also an author of 3 books, including Past Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. Mr. Routledge, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to join you.
Today we talk about universal basic income, an idea that every person in the society should get a fixed and regular sum of money merely for existing. And UBI keeps appearing in the public discussions and is presented both as a utopian dream and as a dystopian nightmare. We will make 2 podcasts with Mr. Routledge. The one you're watching or listening to now is the first one. And if you want to listen to the second part, you can find it in the link in the description below. So I will just go straight to the questions. Mr. Routledge, together with Gonzalo Schwartz, who works with you at Routledge Institute, you have published an article in UBI on Newsweek in which you made the claim that UBI could decrease the psychological capital needed to increase financial independence, and that UBI could harm the entrepreneurial spirit on which the economic prosperity depends. But on the other side of the argument, it is sometimes claimed that if people were economically safer, they would take more risks in, for example, trying to create their own businesses, and therefore we would all be richer and happier if the UBI was introduced. What would be your reaction to that?
So first of all, I should say I have an open mind about UBI. It's something that I've been interested in off and on for many years, and to be honest, my opinion of it has kind of gone back and forth. Like I said, try to be open-minded about it, and because I understand like the elegance of it, the simplicity of the idea sounds very, very attractive and appealing, and it happens to be a topic that, or an idea that you can find some convergence on left and right of politics, which is rare these days. And so, there's something to be said about that. If you can get people, of different political ideologies to converge on a similar solution to a challenge, that doesn't mean that solution's correct, but it at least gives you opportunities to make movement on something, to try something. So, all that being said, I have a lot of concerns that I think that should give people caution. And starting with this question. So yes, it's true. If you look at research on the psychology of entrepreneurship, anxiety, insecurity, these things are barriers to people's entrepreneurial intentions. So part of this is, you can think of, I do a lot of work in motivational psychology, and there's a basic model that I work with that you can think of as like defense versus growth motivation. And the underlying idea is that we need both. That as an organism trying to thrive in the world, we need to focus on security. We need to focus on defense, right? We need to be aware of possible threats and how to be vigilant against them and protect ourselves from them. And so you can think of that at a very, very basic survival level. Like we don't go out of, at a very primitive level. Like we don't wander out of the cave at night because there might be predators out there. We tend to, that's not the time to be, exploring the environment. It's the time to be protective, right? But at the same time, we would never get past the cave if we didn't have the courage, to go forward and explore. And so you don't just need defense, you need growth. Like you need to go out and experiment. You need to be curious. You need to explore the world around you. You need to meet other people. You need to open yourself up to new ideas and possibilities. And there's a legitimate tension between between these motivational tendencies. If you're too explorative, if you're too bold and courageous, you might get yourself killed. If you're not courageous and bold enough, you might starve to death because you were paralyzed in the cave and you were never willing to go out and do things. So we have to navigate these things, and that's not just a primitive world analysis. This is the modern world too. And so at the like psychological level in the present day, we can think of this as when people are feel insecure, they feel like economically threatened in some way. That's when they become more conservative with their money. They kind of pull back. They're like, now's not the time to take risks. I need to make sure that, I've got my basic needs met. And anxiety kind of tells us, kind of as feedback. It's like, oh yeah, like there's a reason I'm anxious about my situation. It is precarious, right? And but it's when we feel secure, when we feel like more, supported in some way, like we've got a good foundation that we're most likely, I'm saying most because it varies by personality, it varies by other factors. There's other factors at play, but that's when we're most likely to say, okay, now I can go try something new. I can take a risk. So from that perspective, the UBI argument makes a lot of sense to people because essentially what they're saying is if we could intervene and help meet people's basic security needs, then that would put them on footing to be more growth motivated. So I get that, but that's an oversimplification in a way, because oftentimes the way that we meet our security needs isn't from some external entity just giving us resources. It's from building that security ourselves within our families, within our communities. And that process of building security, of learning how to like save a rainy day fund, of learning these basic skills might be important, components of the human capital and social capital that actually end up taking entrepreneurial ideas and making them successful. So in other words, just because you give somebody money and they say, okay, now I'm more likely to start a business, doesn't mean that that business is going to succeed. It doesn't mean that that person has the resilience, the financial planning skills, the networking skills, and all these other forms of psychological capital that will help them get through difficult times, that will help them adapt to a changing market. And so it's more complicated than just saying, well, we understand people will be more adventurous, more entrepreneurial when they feel secure. So let's just make them feel more secure, without understanding what that security is actually based on and the underlying variables that might make that work. So here's just another example removed from entrepreneurship. So there's this idea in psychology called attachment, secure attachment. And this is a good understanding. This helps you provide an understanding of the foundation of this. So when infants, when babies are small, if their parents provide them a warm and loving environment, where they know they've got protection, they're more likely to kind of explore. They feel it because they know mom's back there and she's not going to let anything horrible happen. And so they're more likely to like go out and, play with other kids, experiment with, check out toys and things like that. And so that starts to build this kind of cognitive and emotional framework for understanding that tension between I want to have a social support network that fortifies me, and then I can go out and explore. But people wouldn't say, well, you can just replace that mother's love or that parent, of that parent, a deep attachment with some sort of external, like, here, we'll just pay mom to be nice, or we'll just have, there's a relationship that builds there from organically, from feeling like you have a responsibility to your children, from learning what that means. And so it's like, that's something that I think at some level people could kind of understand at a qualitative level. It's not something you could just replace easily, or substitute for something else. And so I think we need to think about that. when we think about programs like UBI, and when we say simple things like, oh, reduce anxiety, reduce uncertainty, people will be more entrepreneurial. And say, okay, but have they actually built the type of relational and social capital and psychological capital infrastructure that's needed to really be secure, or is the security you're providing them, pretty paper thin? And yeah, it might be money, but it's more than that.
I think that part of the appeal of the UBI is that your security won't depend on those kind of social support networks that you've mentioned.
Right. Right.
That you're not dependent on your mother or your father or your boss, and you're sort of you're secure independently on how well you do in your social environment, let's say. Don't you think that is a problem from the perspective of what you've said recently?
Yeah, I do think that's a problem. And yeah, I mean, and people can come up with examples, in fairness to UBI advocates. They will often respond and say, well, some people are really in bad luck. Like some people have horrible parents. Some people have an abusive spouse. Some people have a horrible boss. And so and so they can pull these examples of like, for these people, it might actually help them if you can say you don't have to be in those toxic environments. So I understand that, but you have to look and see, well, first of all, how broadly is that the case? When you're doing a large public policy, you can't just think about a few examples. Of course, we feel horrible for such cases, but is that going to be generally the case? Second of all, if you talk to a lot of entrepreneurs that are successful, a lot of them will have stories of, yeah, I had a horrible boss. Yeah, I had unsupportive parents. Yeah, so it's not necessarily the case that just because you have bad kind of like, unfortunate or difficult social environment or in your network, that those relationships are still, learning to sort of navigate those relationships and build better relationships. I mean, people quit their jobs and find, a better boss. And one of the biggest predictors, I think, of social mobility is having a job, right? And so if UBI was such that you could be like, well, I never have to put up with a bad boss because I could just quit as soon as things get difficult, I think it's worth considering the implications of that as well, and how that might not help you develop, the ability to work with difficult people, the ability, to learn those types of skills of navigating the world.
So having a bad boss can be helpful for you in the long term,
I
let's
mean,
say.
a lot of people start businesses for that reason, right? They say, I got tired of working for people, I wanted to work for myself. I wanted to be in control of my own work because I've worked with all sorts of, bad bosses. And so it actually might be, again, this is to say it's complicated, and I think it's fair to point out these sorts of complexities because when people talk about UBI in a positive way, they not I'm not saying no one has a nuanced argument. It's just they often say, well, it's a simple solution. And like, well, the problem isn't necessarily simple. Life isn't simple.
Yeah, I think it's just the right time to touch the topic of the UBI experiments. So there is
Hmm.
a website called Stanford Basic Income Lab where they list out all the experiments of UBI that are taking
Hmm.
place in all across the globe, and they list that there are either the experiments that are either finished or are being carried out. It's like 200 of them now in the
Hmm.
world, and basically it is claimed that UBI trials have found that UBI improves health, life satisfaction, trust in others, employment opportunities, at least to some extent. And there was, I think, the most famous experiment took place in Finland, and they found that, well, although people were not more likely to find a job, they felt more satisfaction with their lives. And is it a bad thing for people to feel more satisfaction with their lives, right? And experience less mental strain is it a bad thing for people to experience less mental strain? I think not. And probably then the argument is made that, well, if we can just give them a little bit of money and then people just are happier, why shouldn't we? So, as somebody who's been going around these things in the academia for years, do you think that these results actually prove that UBI, if it could be implemented, is a, let's say, desirable idea?
Yeah. So I want to avoid going to, obviously we're not going to litigate every single methodology for all these different experiments. I mean, one of the challenges I think is a lot of experiments are not really UBI, in the sense that they are targeted income programs. They are targeting a small group of people within a city, for instance, which is different than everybody in the whole country getting, which is the universal component of it. Some of them are in very, very poor countries, and in which it's much easier to document that people are spending this money on basic needs, for instance, because there's a lot of insecurity in that country compared to like programs in the US. From the Finland program was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it ended up being canceled. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they canceled it because they decided it's not really worth the money, or yes, but either because the results were not as favorable as they thought. I'm not really sure. I would have to check it, but
Yeah.
yes, it has been canceled before it was finished, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. And so and many of these, at least in the US, are not, from what I understand, they're not replacements for existing social safety net programs, which is one of the libertarian arguments, I think, for UBI is, well, we'll replace the bureaucracy and the kind of regulatory nature of social safety programs with UBI. We can talk about that later, I'm sure. So anyway, they can't all be easily compared to one another because they're in different countries with other different policies imposing on them. They're with different samples. And often, understandably, they're short term. And the people in these programs know, hey, for the next 2 years, I'm going to be getting an extra $500 or $600 a month, which, not surprisingly, is going to boost your well-being. If somebody, I don't need UBI. I'm fortunate to have a decent job. I can meet all my needs. If somebody came to me and said, "Hey, Clay, you're getting 600, as part of this new program, you're going to get $600 a month for the next 2 years," my well-being's going up. I'm pretty sure. And so I think that's I'm not making fun of it. I understand it's difficult, in the defense of these UBI program experiments. It's difficult, I think, how do you really, really test a program and get results that you could meaningfully interpret at scale. And I think that is a real challenge in their defense. But one thing I'll say real quick on some of these outcomes is there's a lot of outcomes not being measured or being ignored as well. I think a number of these experiments haven't shown increases in employment, for instance, and labor market participation. Some have maybe shown a little bit of action. Some have some negative, right? Some have shown that people are less likely to participate. Some of them, the amount of money is too small to move the needle on that. But then what people will say is, "Oh, look, it didn't increase labor market participation." It's like, well, you gave people a couple $100 a month. That's not enough to move the needle. But then I think you have to go back to if this is really about poverty, if this is really about social mobility, if this is really about like how do we help the people who are who are the least economically successful, how do we help them flourish? How do we help them thrive? You need to look at the extent to which people are using this giving somebody $1,000 or whatever. We're not even getting into how you would pay for if every American got, $1,000 a month, we're talking about trillions of dollars, right? In the universe, because it would be universal. So ignoring the economic side of things, um, you have to consider like, well, how is this going to help people, or how is this going to affect people's ability to build a life long term of well-being? And so I think you need to think of well-being not as like momentary satisfaction with life, but a more holistic and longer term approach, like long-term goal, progress, and success. And again, I think we know from research and social mobility, having a job, education, marriage, there are a number of factors that are strong predictors of people's overall like lifetime, like well-being, including their perceptions of meaning in life, and including their ability to their kind of psychological resilience. And it's not as simple as negative versus positive emotions. It's not as simple as, oh, like I'm happier now because, I have more money. There's achievements that come from like that feeling of you did something, you figured out something yourself. You worked with, you developed deep relationships with people in your community and in your local labor market. You solved problems using your own resilience. And it's hard to measure those things in these types of studies, or they're often not measured. Again, I'm not saying this about, I'm not condemning all these studies, but some of these I think are pretty ideologically motivated, so they're not well like set up to really think about the potential negative effects. And even the ones that, even the people that are, I think there are researchers that are looking at this stuff very objectively. It's very difficult, like I said, to kind of think about in a single experiment how to best capture all the possible, downstream effects of these programs.
As a psychologist, you have looked at how people perceive, let's say, meaning in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And well, could you tell us a bit about how those things are measured and how those things are, well, let's say, first of all, conceptualized and then measured?
Yeah.
So we could have an idea of what you mean by that.
Yeah, yeah. So meaning in life is conceptualized as an abstract concept that at some cognitive scientists, for instance, think about it at a very, very low level, in which any organism's desire or motivation to make sense of their environment. So you can think of meaning at a very low, like pattern perception level, like you want the world to make sense so you can navigate it. We do that, other organisms do that. But humans are intellectual. So we don't just look out at the world and say, okay, I want to be able to model this, so I can predict my environment reasonably. We also turn inward to look at our own lives, and we want to make sense of our own existence, right? And so we're able to ask these questions such as, why am I here? What purpose do I serve? And you can also think about how that motivation is related to or connects to other motives, such as a need to belong, a social orientation. We're kind of a status-oriented species, so always looking for like where we rank in any given moment, in any given environment. And so and meaning plugs into that as well. But at a basic level, the way a lot of psychologists are interested in meaning, they're interested in this higher order meaning, this perception that I matter, that my life is meaningful. And they have to measure this with like the satisfaction with life example you provided a minute ago. A lot of these are often measured with these kind of self-report questionnaires, like I perceive my life as meaningful. Meaning can be broken down into sub factors. So for example, like people often talk about purpose in life. So it's not just that my existence is meaningful, but I have a clear purpose, which is measured more with kind of goal related questions about directionality. Like I know where I'm going. I know I know what I'm trying to do. I have a clear goal in mind and I'm pursuing it. And so there's those factors. My colleagues and I are interested in this concept that we call existential agency, which is the idea that you can have a very passive perception of meaning. You could just say, for instance, you could just say from a religious orientation that God created us all we're all meaningful because we're all God's creations. Religious people might say that, but oftentimes on top of it, even for people who are very religious or for people who are not religious, oftentimes there's just more agentic component too. It isn't just the case that my existence is meaningful because of, a divine creation. It's like I have to live up to that meaning. It's on me to take responsibility for fulfilling my purpose, right? And so there's this agentic component of meaning, which again you can measure with questionnaires about to what extent do people feel like they're able to, that they have the power to live meaningful lives. So there's those types of measurement questions. So one thing that's interesting is researchers have started to look at, well, okay, at the end of the day, what is the dimension of meaning that is most strongly predictive of overall perceptions of meaning? Is it some kind of religious orientation, like God, like a cosmic significance? Is it some type of, like success, career success? Like, what is it that makes us feel the most meaningful or like contributes the most to our overall perceptions of meaning? And basically it's social significance. So it's the feeling that I matter. So social mattering. It's the idea that I'm playing an important role in the lives of others. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because I think it's important when, whatever programs we're thinking about, whatever policies we're thinking about, it's important to think about really what matters to people, what gives them the greatest sense of like, I have a reason to exist. I have a reason to get up every day and work hard, and I'm motivated to contribute to the world around me, is that sense that I'm needed. Like I play an important role. Like people are counting on me. It's not being liked. It's not like just social popularity. It's not just the sense that, well, even among deeply religious people, it's not just the sense, well, God created me, so I inherently have meaning. It really is that sense that I'm a meaningful member of a broader, meaningful cultural drama. Like I have a role to play. I'm not just sitting on the bench. I'm on the court doing something significant. And I think that's to me, that's a fundamental component of any discussion about any program's effects on well-being and flourishing needs to factor in the fact that people need to feel like they don't passively matter, but they actively matter, that people are counting on them to contribute to the world.
I think this is very interesting because there is a pro UBI argument that's very often made, and it goes something like this: that if you sort of meet people's basic security needs,
Mm-hmm.
needs like having something to eat, having somewhere to sleep, and then it would free up their energy so that people could focus on, let's say, their higher needs. So I think this is based on some sort of image in which you have a job to sustain yourself, and then you have a hobby that's meaningful to you, and then you can, let's say, achieve self-actualization in the
Yeah.
hobby, through the hobby. Yes, but what you've just said, like, it makes that kind of image very, very oversimplified, doesn't
Yeah. Well,
it?
that self-actualization, that particular proposal that is not that, we're talking about evidence for these different things. I mean, it's not well evidenced. I mean, if you look at, and we've done some of this work, like large organizations like Pew Research have done some of this work globally. If you look at what gives people's lives meaning, um, more than anything else, it's relationships. It's interdependent relationships. It's not hobbies. So it's not to say that those things aren't part of living a full life. It's just to say that, okay, as an example, if you had two people and one of them was, taking care of a family, working hard, doing even perhaps an unpleasant or stressful job, but they knew their children were dependent on them and they had a responsibility towards them, and they were making a difference, really making a difference in their lives. They were taking care of them. And you had somebody else who didn't have those responsibilities, and just was able to pursue whatever interest that, whatever hobbies they had, in some ways that other person might have score higher on certain well-being things. They'd certainly score lower on stress. Their life would be less stressful. Um, but when it comes to like, am I doing something to meaningfully impact the world? They're not going to score higher in that. They might score higher on other well-being indicators, but those other well-being indicators, the more hedonic ones, are not really the motivational components of a successful life. And I don't, I'm not just saying that as like a value judgment. I mean, meaning is a stronger predictor of mental health, of resilience, of, goal pursuit, persistence than happiness is, or than other kind of like affective components. Like meaning carries more power, motivational power. So that's what I mean by living a more, full life. It's really, and meaning is, one of the strongest predictors of not just depression, but the suicide. So it really is a key component to a flourishing life, that sense of meaning. It's why, and I brought up the parent example. There's good research that parents have report higher levels of meaning than non-parents. To be clear, that's not to say that you have to be a parent to have meaning, but the reason parents score higher on meaning, I think, is it's easier for them to detect their meaning, because it's like, I'm taking care of kids. And in fact, in these studies, they have these methodologies where you can kind of ping people randomly throughout the day on their cell phones and give them a questionnaire, at different intervals. And you can say, oh, what are you doing right now? And how does it make you feel? And these sorts of things. And what they find is not only do parents report higher levels of meaning, they report the highest levels of meaning when they're actually taking care of their kids, even though they might also be reporting stress and negative mood and things like that. So it's like, because they can see, like, it's like very proximally. I think this might actually help explain too why it gets complicated to make cross-cultural comparisons, but and people tend to be happier in richer countries, but it's more complicated when you look at meaning in life. A lot of times in poor countries, people score higher in meaning. And again, I think it's, it's hard to make these comparisons super meaningful. But one reason, even when you control religiosity for it, so in poorer countries, people are more religious, which increases meaning. But more than that, there's a strong sense of interdependence. You can easily see how you're impacting other people's lives. If you're poor, that's not an argument for that's not an argument to say people should be poor. I just think it's a good reason to think about, as societies become more abundant, it's worth not forgetting what the fundamentals of a meaningful life are. And it's not just it's great to have more consumer products. It's great to have more abundance. But at the end of the day, even in rich societies, people really need to they really need to find ways to make a difference, to feel like they are valued. So in abundant societies, we actually might have a different set of challenges for meaning making than in poor societies, which again is another warning to be kind of careful about making comparisons of how UBI might work and the countries that are less economically developed compared to rich affluent countries in Europe and the United States and European countries.
Yeah, but you don't think that sort of it's a necessary, how should I put that? It is sort of necessary if you live in a society that's more abundant, you will be more lonely and therefore have a less meaningful life.
No, I don't think that. I don't think that at all. I think what really it's more the case that it's because meaning, and this is my speculation. I think it's more the case that it might be harder to detect meaning the further you are removed from that kind of like basic survival. You know what I mean? Because if you can easily see, so for instance, like you can think about another way to think about it is think about young people. Like young people in the United States are often kind of sheltered from scarcity because we live in an abundant society. And in fact, we know that in the US, one of the some people aren't concerned about this, other people are concerned. We know that labor force participation has been decreasing among teenagers and young adults. So it used to be when I was growing up, it was very, very common for once you turned 15 or 16 to get a job. And this is like, oh, you go work after school, you go work part-time, you save up so you can buy a car, you're saving money for college and things like that. So that was considered a pretty normal rite of passage to have a teenage job. The percentage of young adults in the US who are doing that is decreasing, and we're also seeing more and more not just young adults, but teenagers. We're also seeing more and more adults, particularly young men, not participating in the labor force. And they're, and I think they're like they feel less meaningful because they're not seeing like how they're making a difference. They're just like, oh, my parents are taking care of everything. They might be having fun. They might be getting to go to more concerts and have more adventures. And I'm not saying that doesn't contribute to, some kind of component of well-being, but there's younger people are struggling more with finding meaning than older generations, I think. And again, it's hard to make comparisons across time and across cultures, but I think part of the challenge is they haven't really they're not like really like feel like they're contributing. That's why I think it's actually really good for to give your kids chores to make sure they feel like they're part of the household economy. To give them opportunities to contribute, to see like, oh, like the family is depending on me in some way. Like I am making a difference. I'm not just benefiting from, there's all these, tropes about spoiled rich kids. And I think that's a different set of challenges. But no, I don't think it's inherently the case that because you live in an abundant society, you can't find meaning. I think it's just like we need to remember what those ingredients of meaning are. And in fact, in abundant societies, there is something to the argument about like, well, if people are able to pursue their interests, their more authentic interests, that'll be better for meaning. I think that there is something to that. I just don't think that UBI is the pathway to it. What happens in a society that has all has free markets, creates these opportunities in the marketplace that just gives people more opportunities to pursue their natural talents and interests. But they need to do it in a competitive way that really, like the previous point, the previous point of discussion on anxiety and entrepreneurship, they need to be able to do it in a way in which they are stress tested, in which they do have competition, in which they do have to figure out what they're made of. And so I think a lot of these things are well-intentioned attempts to sort of skip those processes and just say, well, let's just throw some money in here. And that's the most proximal variable to people feeling more authentic or doing what they want. And they don't maybe think about how people got there is actually an important role. How you got to the point where you can pursue more hobbies might actually be important. It's not just that you can pursue those hobbies. It might be like that sense of like satisfaction you have for fulfillment. I've worked really hard to build a life, to climb the income ladder, to save money, to figure out my problems. That has now given me more opportunity, more time to pursue these other interests. It's like the way people got there might be important. Like this might sound like a silly example, but this just came to mind. So if you're a chef or even just a person who likes to cook, do you think it's going to be more meaningful, more satisfactory, more interesting if somebody delivers a pizza to your door and lets you pretend you made it and say, oh, here's my pizza. It smells good. It tastes wonderful. This is the best pizza I've ever had. Like, my authenticity is fulfilled. Or do you think like taking the years to experiment, to make lousy pizzas, to try to figure out how to properly take care of your sourdough starter to do the bread recipe, to do the dough recipes, to experiment with different things and how to cook it. Like that process, that difficult process, which is going to involve lots of failed experiments, lots of lousy pizza, lots of like, I should just give up on this hobby because it's not worth it. But eventually, if you get to like, oh, wow, I made this really good pizza, do you think that's not going to be more fulfilling, more meaningful, more authentic than somebody just saying, well, why do you have to do all that work making the pizza? I could just give you the pizza. It's, in fact, my pizza might be better than your pizza. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like that's oftentimes we're ignoring all the things that went up into that final product and thinking, well, we can just kind of substitute for that by giving people this basic income.
Yes, before we go too far from the experiments topic, I wanted to make this point that so if you have an UBI experiment, right, you can run it for, let's say, 2 years or 3 years or maybe 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you really want to know what it's going to be like after 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of experiment says nothing about it. And maybe one of the reasons is that, well, people, if they're participating in a UBI experiment that runs for like 4 years, they know that after 4 years they will still have to maintain themselves and they will have to work somewhere, and they cannot let themselves just to fall out of the labor market, let's say, right?
Right. Right. No,
So
that's a great point.
so in that sense, do you think that, well, do you think that we have some sort of over, how should I put that? Well, we tend to over rely on that kind of, social experiments and
Yeah.
the results when we're making decisions about our policy. And it maybe in our discussions in UBI, that we tend to somehow overemphasize how important are the findings of such experiments. Don't you think so?
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. And so for example, when I was working on my PhD in graduate school, the consensus around the topic of violent media and violent video games in particular was that they were bad in the sense that they caused that if you played violent video games, you were more likely to be aggressive and violent yourself. That was the consensus. And that consensus was built on laboratory experiments that were very like closed in the sense that like you play some video games and then they measure like feelings of aggression or hostility or even simulated aggression. Um, and they found like some effects. What they what they didn't realize was in reality, and outside of the laboratory, when people are playing video games, there are these other external forces acting on them. For instance, you might know, well, if I'm aggressive in the real world, I might lose my job or get arrested or get kicked out of school. And so how people how people behave in a certain like controlled context is not you really have to think about, well, how is the broader world gonna how is the broader environment gonna, and not just the like physical environment, like you said, the temporal nature of it too, the longer term nature of it. So yeah, I think there's a history of research in which it was based on failing to understand or at least consider that there's a broader context and there's a broader time horizon. And anytime you think about this, you need to consider those possibilities that, and it might seem like, well, what if violent video games have to do with this? But that's just one example of how these types of experiments can be useful, can help you understand things, but you need to remember the context that they're done and to be like, well, we just learned something about, like you said, about how this might influence people's like well-being if they know it's only going to be a few years, right? And so we kind of do this, like we kind of do this in other ways, not experimentally, but just naturally. So when you go to university, for instance, you know you're not going to be there forever, right? You're going to be there for 3 or 4 years in the US, 4 years in the UK, 3 years. so around that time, 3 or 4 years. And so you wouldn't expect like how people are feeling and what they're doing in their university years to be predictive of their whole life, because you would know, well, this is sort of an environment where kids are going off to spend time in this particular context, and that's going to be different when they get out. So it's a little bit like that. It's like you can't, like you said, you can't just take something that's only going to last a certain period of time and understand how that's not just going to influence people in their own lifetime past that 4 years, but also the intergenerational component too, of like what's that's going to mean 40, 50 years from now
Yeah,
for the next generation.
and talking about this intergenerational question, like so in the Lithuanian Free Market Institute, we are working with on the UBI, and there are many questions that we are trying to ask. And one of the questions that we try to ask was, okay, so how could this affect like a generation that would grow up with the UBI, and let's say a generation whose parents grew up with the UBI. And then we had a very interesting discussion with an academic. Her name is Danuta Gailiene, and she explored the intergenerational trauma of people who were affected by the atrocities that the Soviet communists did for our country, for Lithuania. And one of the things that she said in the discussion was that there is this thing that people tend to have a sort of different memory when they, let's say, different historical memory when they receive the information from people who knew the life before, let's say, Soviet communism, or let's say the life before the UBI, and when it's just some historical information, let's say books or movies or anything. And I don't know how valid and how far this point can go, but maybe one of the reasons that, for example, Lithuania and the other Baltic states made a successful transition after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia did not, is that we had Soviet communism for 3 generations, and everyone still had contact with somebody who lived before the Soviet communism, and the Russians had it for slightly longer time, like for 20 years more than us. But that changes a lot because you have 4 generations, and then everybody whom you know has just seen the Soviet communism and nothing else.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make this point, and I think we're approaching the end of our first discussion. And yeah, before we begin, could you tell us a little bit more about, let's say I think this is a popular topic to explore, but let's say what kind of personality traits or personality types made the West so successful, or at least, let's say, brought into existence and sustained all what is positive about capitalism.
Yeah. So, there are psychological traits, or what we call individual differences, personality traits, but individual differences is kind of a broader category that represents, really the characteristics that a person brings to the table that, of course, interact with social and environmental and broader cultural, political, economic characteristics. But at the psychological level, not surprisingly, like curiosity, risk taking, like we tend to think of risk taking as bad, and it can be like criminals, for instance, score high on risk taking. But risk taking also has very positive effects when it's engaged in legal entrepreneurial activities. So people who are just more kind of tolerant of uncertainty, curious, explorative, resilient, like emotionally, psychologically resilient, ambitious. These are traits, and I think when we think about like the success of capitalism, I think part of what this is, it's not like these are traits that are unique to the West. It's just that in free societies, you allow these traits to emerge more. So another way to think about it is all over the world, these traits exist. But there are cultures, there are economic systems, there are authoritarian societies that put lots of barriers up to where these traits can't be fully exposed or revealed or actualized. And I think the West's success, not just now not just the West, of course, societies that are free, that are open, um, that have, that aren't corrupt, that have rule of law, that have, that value education and openness, that aren't dogmatic. Those are the societies in which these particular traits are really allowed, are set free and allowed to, to really allow people to really reach their full potential. And also, you can think about immigration in a similar way. Like if you have a society, like a country, like historically the United States, we're an immigrant country. And if you have if people see, oh, that's the place, here's a place where people like me have opportunities to do what we want, to pursue our entrepreneurial goals, to pursue our intellectual interests, then people might be attracted to those places. So again, I think it's not so much that the West has certain traits; it's that along the road of development, an understanding of the power of freedom, allowing people to really pursue and develop these characteristics. In addition to that, I think education gives people the opportunity to develop some of these traits. So some of these traits we can think of as kind of inherent, like we have different personalities genetically. But there's also traits can be expanded on. Things can be taught. So maybe you're a natural athlete and I'm not, but you're going to be you're going to be more likely to, even if you are a natural athlete, you're going to be more likely to be successful if you're in an environment in which you're really given the opportunity to pursue your athleticism. And even if I'm not that athletic, I could benefit from somebody teaching me how to be more athletic, because we know, like, for example, like physical exercise is good for everyone's health, not just athletes' health. And so helping people, you can think of education that way, helping people teaching these traits, even though they vary from person to person, giving people more opportunities to learn how to develop these characteristics. Sometimes we refer to it as a psychological capital. You can also connect this to broader social capital. And again, freedom is like, capitalistic societies, free market, open societies, and not just like free market, but free thinking societies in which we don't have dogmatic or authoritarian cultural structures that tell people they can't do these things or that discourage people from doing things. I mean, I think this is one of the biggest challenges we face in the United States, for instance, is we have a growing kind of pessimistic culture. It's not that there's not the opportunities for people to pursue things. It's that people are falling into a kind of a victimhood mindset in which they believe that they can't pursue these things, that there is no opportunity. So it's like the culture's putting like a barrier to freedom and flourishing, even if in the economic landscape they actually have more opportunities than, for instance, people did generations ago.
Yeah, I think the Lithuanian experience is that we had to transition to capitalism from 50 years after 50 years of Soviet communism, and we really had this problem that they were used to government giving them a job, they were used to government giving them a place to live, and then suddenly you have to go to the jungle and fight for yourself, and it
Right.
was difficult, and I think that for many people this was a huge trauma. And then when you get this kind of authoritarian structure that, let's say, well, that is very violent and very restrictive, but also does some sort of taking care of you, then it's very hard to get away from it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the risk that, Well, that's one reason why the West shouldn't probably, the West broadly, everyone shouldn't experiment with things like, like UBI. That it would be very, very hard for people to get off the UBI after, if let's say it's implemented, and then after 10 years you realize that this doesn't work and you have to cancel.
Yeah. No, no, that's a great point.
Okay, so Mr. Routledge, thank you again for appearing on the Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast. This was the first part of our discussion. For those who want to watch the second part, you can go and find the link in the description. And thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.